I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars. On this video, I'm standing in front of our next build for the YouTube channel. It's a 1969 Firebird. We didn't have to go very far for this car as it's about 60 feet from my garage. It's been here for years. This car is very special to me. I figured now's the best time to be able to do this and build it. I've had this car since I was 16 years old, actually maybe 15, but I got this car and this kind of got me into the building aspect and the restoration where I want to be. This car shaped a lot of what I do now on vehicles. It doesn't look like it in its state of decay, and I'll go over that story. But on this whole build series on this car, the idea is we're going to go ahead and we're going to build it the way I want to build it. I don't have anyone to answer to. I can finally show you the ins and outs and exactly my style, how I like to build them, and I can prove to you that I also believe in this stuff so much that I would do it to my own vehicle. We're going to start off by saying this car and everything I'm going to put into it is not going to be worth it. I mean, I'm going to spend way too much time, money, and effort bringing this 69 Firebird back to life when you could go out and buy a pretty decent car. However, knowing a pretty decent car probably has hidden rust, hidden filler like this did when we got it, and a lot of other issues. So I know if we're gonna build it, this car should last decades and decades to come, and me and my family should be able to enjoy it. So the first thing we're gonna do, like I said, we're gonna get the car, we're gonna get it in the garage, we're gonna first clean it out. It's been sitting in this spot right now for about 4 years or so. I actually spent most of the morning taking out all the scrap metal and everything. It was kind of used for parts storage. So follow along to this whole video. We'll get it on the frame jig. I already prepped all that stuff, and me and my son will probably get this thing stripped down and we'll get an assessment on where we're looking for. I also want to say I'm not the only one that builds these F-body cars on YouTube and stuff. I actually was talking to a guy, Juby Mays. He has a channel, Amazing Metalworks. Go check his stuff out. I mean, this car's pretty far gone, but that guy right there built one of these F-bodies. It was a Camaro, a 69 Camaro, I believe it was, from the ground up. So what's good about these F-body cars, in that video, that guy's YouTube shows it right there, that you can build one of these cars. The parts are available. The first gen F-body cars are just a good platform, and the aftermarket support is really, it's top notch. The reason we're also doing an F-body is, you saw in the past, most of my channel has been E-body stuff. We had B-body stuff. The first video on this channel was a 69 Firebird, a similar car to this. One of my buddies needed a car built. And really how I started this YouTube channel and what I was thinking is, it was just to show customers what we're doing with their cars. Thanks to everyone out there, and I appreciate this. It's kind of, people show real interest and started asking for feedback. So we started doing tutorial videos instead of just showing customers and clients, and it's really blown up. So I think this car, what I want to do, I want to show what we can do with F-body cars. Like I said, we do mostly E-bodies. We have a couple Fords down the road that we're going to put on the channel, and there's some other cars. So right now, all I have in line is E-bodies and a couple Novas and everything, and there's nothing wrong with that. I like building them, but this is going to show what we can do with this car, where we're going to go, and hopefully if you have a first gen F-body, this is how you build it, or maybe you could send it to us and I'll build yours too. So stay tuned, let's get cracking into this car and we'll go over it.
Growing up in the Northeast, I was always into snowmobiles, ATVs, three-wheelers. We'd always fix them up and everything. We had a neighbor, a family friend down the road that restored antique trackers and old Mopars at the time. So I've always been around these old cars and just being in garages with people restoring them and fixing them up. I always thought that was so cool. I remember even one time putting flames on that cow hood on our lawn tractor. But my parents decided for a birthday present around 1999 that they were going to go ahead and they were going to buy me a car. It was be a cheap car, it was going to be a muscle car, and I could fix it up. And what I was looking for, I was actually looking for a Mopar. But even at the time, on my parents' budget, I couldn't find anything. I thought this 69 Firebird had the closest thing with the split nose bumper on the front to what I liked and what I could relate to from Mopars back in the day. So in 1999 on Craigslist, I remember finding two 69 Firebirds. They're both in Long Island, New York. I remember at the time this car was the more expensive of the two, and my dad ended up calling the guy, and the guy basically said if you come out look at this one first, he was going to drop the price to match the price of the other 69 Firebird we were looking at. It was the only time I've ever been on Long Island. I remember it was like a 4 or 5 hour drive we went to look at this car. We went out there and I fell in love with this car. So the story from the guy that I bought the car at the time, who was probably around 22 to 25, what he said was he went to vocational school. This car was kind of a shop car that he brought up there, and they donated some parts to him, and they donated the time while they were teaching on the car. I believe it was more the mechanical, as they built this more as a bracket car, and I believe he raced it at a track doing some bracket races. We're talking about mid-90s. If anyone recognizes this Firebird and knows any more information, reach out to me. It'd be really cool to find some more history on the car. We ended up buying this car for $1,200 at the time. I know it was really cool too because I got to drive home in the passenger seat. Again, I'm 15 years old. With the owner drove it. I think he drove about 4 or 5 hours to my house in this car. We went downtown New York City. I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. As far as fixing it up and everything, we kind of dressed up some stuff and did some cosmetic stuff here or there at the time. But most of the time we just ended up doing burnouts in the driveway, and I pretty much got my license and drove it as is. I was happy enough the way it was. It was on the road. We were kind of getting some street races in it, just having fun, tinker around with it. It was a good car at its time. So the '09 and flames on the door. These are just bad being young decisions, along with too many episodes of Dukes of Hazzard and my love of dirt track racing. At 19, I joined the Army, and I was out in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. You could see that's why the car has Arizona plates on it. I was actually supposed to go to V-Spot in Germany on orders, but I realized the car couldn't come, and I like North Carolina better, so I actually dropped the airborne packet, and that sent me to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. 2004-2005 time I was deployed to Iraq. I had a buddy at the time who did restorations, and he was going to help me out, and he was going to fix this car up and make it nice. So at the time, living in barracks, I had no option to fix it up. That seemed like the best route to go. So 2 weeks before I left, I had all my automotive buddies. All my friends I grew up were into cars and stuff. They all came by, and we gutted this car and got it prepped for the most part, as much as we can do for the restoration. Halfway through the deployment, I get an email from my parents stating that the Firebird is back at their house, and the guy, my buddy of mine that was restoring the car, said this is too much work and the car's unrestorable. Just get another 69 Firebird. It won't be worth the restoration costs. He was actually correct in a sense, but I had sentimental value in this car, and I figured one day I'm going to fix this thing up. Fast forward, my parents got divorced, so the car had to leave their house. It ended up around some other family member's house where I paid rent and everything. At the time, somehow all my parts went missing along some of these trips, travels. I want to do a shout out to my buddy Kyle, because he actually got this car and pretty much saved it probably from the scrapper when the property had to be cleaned out. That was somewhere between 2007 and 2009 where I was deployed again and had no way of getting up there to get the car. So from 2008 to about 2018, the car sat at my mom's house, rusting away, stripped down. I was more focused on racing at the time and working on other cars, as this car is obviously a big project and most of the time was over my head around the 2008 to do it the right way. I finally went up there one day and decided I'm going to go get my old Firebird and bring it back. Figured if it was in my yard and I look at it, eventually I'll get tired enough and I'll actually start the project. So that really brings us to present day of this Firebird and where we are right now with it sitting in my garage. So now that you saw basically what we just did, we completely cleaned out the car and just got the leaves out of it, and we got it in the garage. The idea now is we'll get it on the lift, we'll get some of the wheels, the axle stripped out of the car, and get this car mounted on a frame jig. As much as we're going to have to cut off of this thing, it needs that support. You see the Challenger next to it, everything I build is really on a frame jig, and it really makes the builds, the quality of the car come out a lot better, and it makes it easier on myself. We're trying to pre-plan some of our lifting points, knowing that we are going to have to weld on certain parts of this frame jig. But you see, we're going to slide the frame jig under the car. We're going to go ahead and my son's going to take the wheels off the car. Once we get the wheels off the car and the things that are in the way of the frame jig, we're going to go ahead and start unbolting some of the suspension that's in the way. Another good thing about my frame jig, you see they all have wheels under them. So even when the wheels and the suspension and everything comes off these cars, they're still mobile and can be moved around in the future. Also, now that the car is up in the air on the lift, I can give you a quick walk around on what's left of this car. You see a lot of this repair too. I did some of those floor pans, I believe, at the time, but most of the repairs, this car has been rusted and rotted since even before I got it in the 90s. You could see the fuel cell that was in there, so obviously we're going to need a trunk floor. We're going to need most of the parts under here, the inner outer wheel wells. I mean, I think the whole back of this car pretty much is going to be removed. There's quarter skins on top of quarter panels. They're not welded in properly, so they're just dangling coming on and off. It looks like the rockers might be somewhat rusted out on certain areas, so we don't know for sure yet. We're coming up with a plan still, depending on how rough the car is. What I'm doing right now, I'm using a frame jig to my advantage and removing the whole rear axle assembly. Basically, we're going to slide it out on a whole body dolly versus trying to lift it and break our backs on this whole deal. So you see everything's unbolted. We just lift the car off of it. We're going to remove the rear end, and then we'll slide the whole jig assembly back under the car with no axle, and that will enable us to get our rear mounts for our jig without running into leaf springs, axles, or anything else like that. At this point, I did leave the whole front subframe assembly on the car. I wanted to put my jig points around the subframe assembly, and I'm also trying to overhang the assembly as far on the jig as possible. I basically have the jig lined up with the rear frame rails for the back, and then the front as much as I can get on there. What my son and I are doing right now, we're basically leveling out the jig fixture, because what we want to do, we know the car is not level on this cantilever lift. So what we're going to do, we're going to make 2 points. You see my son's holding it up right now, my daughter. We're lifting it up close to it, getting it level, where when we drop the car on the 2 mounts that are cut the exact same length, then the car has no choice but to go level off the jig. What I'm doing right now, I'm basically dropping a plumb blob on both sides, frame reference points on all. I did 4 corners of the car, and the idea is we need to make sure the car is squared up and centered on this frame table. The reason being, if I have to take any suspension measurements or anything else I'm going to modify, or if something moves, I need to go back to the frame table and be able to know exactly where that is squared up, and we don't want our wheels moving. It's just a simple way to check it. And how I'm doing, I'm basically adjusting with the sledgehammer back and forth on my plumb blob lines on the front. I did the front first, and then I worked my way to the back and just basically got the whole car squared within 1/8 of an inch, which is really good considering on the run of this car and as old as the car is. This also verifies that to me personally, that the car hasn't been in a major wreck. If you're doing this and you see a 1-inch difference and you know your jig's squared up, then there's a good chance this car was hit, buckled somewhere. So now we're going to go ahead and burn in the front mounts. We're basically still just tacking everything in place until we get our 4 corners, and then I re-verify the squareness of everything. So you see, I kind of went to a mount next to the body mount on the front subframe. That will enable me to take the front subframe in and out of the car while the car's still being held onto the jig fixture, because the goal of this car, I have an ultimate goal in mind right now. I'll share more of that with the future, but it's going to be to kind of modify the front clip a little bit. Now that the front end's welded in place, you can actually see the clip separating from the body. The bushings are so worn out as we lower it, but I lowered it down onto the front mounts to make sure now the car is leveling itself out, and I'm going ahead and I'm welding the car itself to the jig points. Now what we're going to do, we're going to verify, we're going to put a level on the rockers and verify that the car is level front to rear. I'm also going to take a tape measure from the lower rocker and go to the frame jig. I did. It was actually 8¼ inches. This doesn't matter because it's a ratio on how high you made your front brackets. So we basically pulled the front lift points out of the car, and we're basically lifting the back end up with my son watching the level to get those rockers level. The front is welded in, so it's going to pivot off that point. Once we get those rockers level, we go ahead and we welded in these bars for the rear support. You see that's going to hold us level, and this is just our first bar in our jig point till I figure out where exactly I want my other jig points. Here's a picture of the front jig points. You can see we went up under a body pin underneath and came off the back side of it. At this point, the car's mounted to the jig, everything's solid. I had to have my son go up there and just hold up the exhaust that's still dangling while we get the lift out of this car. Now that the lift's coming out of the car, and we can start the process of actually gutting this car front to rear. When stripping out these cars, usually I'm going to start on the front windshield or the rear window, and we're going to remove them first. This windshield's already been damaged. There's no way I'm reusing it, but we don't want to just break it any more than it is. Same thing with the rear window. More than likely we'll end up putting a rear window glass in the car. However, we were able to remove the rear window without breaking it. This is kind of one of those hit or miss items that a lot of times you won't be able to save, but a special window cutter like I have here that drags the blade right across it really helps in this process. From there, we're going to just grab a bunch of sockets, screwdrivers, and we'll just start pulling everything off. You have to realize a car this old, and most of this stuff really probably hasn't ever been off this car. You're going to break a lot of things, you're going to snap a lot of bolts, and a lot of this stuff is not going to be reused. That's just part of the restoration game. What you need to do, you need to come up with a final product and what you envision your car. And for me, these parts are not going to be up to the standard where I see this Firebird. At this point, we're going to go ahead and remove the doors. What I'm trying to do right now is leave all the window track regulators and everything inside the door, and we're going to pull them off one piece. The reason being is the inside of the structures are really bad, and I know in the 69 F bodies they do make a complete door assembly. So we might look into that and see how bad the doors are. That's a decision for down the road. But at this point, it'll be easier to store everything if it's currently inside the door and I know where everything goes. You can see right now I'm starting to remove all the suspension on the front clip. The idea is it's going to be easier to remove now while it's still attached to the car. And then now that everything's removed, the suspension stripped down off the subframe, it's going to be prepared to be sandblasted. The goal is probably to keep this front subframe. I don't see any damage on it, so we'll take it off, clean it up, sandblast it, and I'll figure out what parts we're going to add to it in the future. But you see we got the bolts unbolted and we just lift it right out. At this point in time, I have everything removed from the car except the exhaust system because I have to rotate the jig assembly out and pull the exhaust out the back. But what we're going to do, since we have our front and rear mounts in place for our jig points, we're going to go through and I'm finding spots of the car I think I'm keeping. I'm going to go ahead and support them with all these brackets and bars, so when we start cutting the car apart, nothing moves. That's the goal. We leave it on this frame jig table and we cut everything apart, and these I-beams are so stiff that nothing on this car should move up. That's the whole idea of building a jig for one of these cars. If they're not wrecked, you can build it off the car. You don't need the factory frame measurements. Now what I will do, I'm gonna go back through before we cut this off and double check all these frame height measurements and just make sure everything's good. If at that point I find something that looks odd and is off, we can cut this one of these bars, these support bars, and modify it, either lifting it up further away from the jig or jacking it back down. But right now this is just to hold the car before we cut it up.
All right, we're pretty much going to wrap up the video on the 69 Firebird. I'll give you a couple final thoughts. So we got everything unbolted that we could possibly, for the most part, unbolt. Everything from this point on would have to be cut off, and that's going to be in the next video. The car, we knew the car was bad. I knew the car was bad. Like most things that come in here, it's worse than I thought. I mean, what I realized after stripping this car is back when I got it in '99, this thing was pretty much not even roadworthy at that point. I told you, like my buddy said, this project was too big of a project and not worth doing it. I mean, looking at it, he's right. But I have sentimental value in this car. Anyone that asks me, hey, do you think it's worth it doing all this work on this model car? I don't. I mean, this car, for instance, is it going to be worth it in the long run? Probably not, but is it something I want to do and I have sentimental value for? Yeah, so stay tuned. We're going to fix this car up. What's pretty interesting, you see the work, these are just skins on it, and I mean, I didn't take this off. This is pretty much how it was. They weren't welded properly, and found something interesting while pulling off the Bondo. They're 69 Camaro quarter skins on the 69 Firebird. So what I'm assuming, this work has been done maybe since the late 80s, early 90s, probably when the Firebird parts weren't produced at this point. So you could see we had got bad there. Some other stuff you see, the window channels up around the roof drip line and everything, they're really rusted out, and the floor pans. You see now that I pulled the parts off the floor pans, I mean, it's pretty bad when your patches start rusting over the floor pan. So that being said, like I said, this video, we have a plan. I have a plan for the car. What the plan's gonna be, one, it's not gonna be gold. I'm not an originality type of person. I'm gonna build this car to kind of a little bit, not wild, but it's not gonna be factory. We're gonna do a couple things that I wanna do on these cars. I haven't quite decided on the color, but right now the plan is get the sheet metal fixed on the car, and we'll start kind of tinkering around with some other stuff and options. I already know the motor that's going in the car. Transmission still unsure of, so stay tuned for all that. I don't want to give too much on the car. Like I said, this is also going to be more of a night and weekend project for me. I still have full-time shop duties going on around here. This isn't going to get in the way of anyone else's car. Basically, if anyone knows this, I've been racing for the past 10, 15 years, and that pretty much spent most of my nights and weekends. Well, about 6 months ago, 7 months ago, leader spun out and I was running about 4th or 5th, and I got in a giant pile up on the racetrack, totaled the race car. So I've actually haven't been to the racetrack since then. So I've had a lot of extra free time, and really, I think, you know, before I fix up the race car and everything else, this is pretty much holding the spot where the race car would normally sit. So I'm going to dedicate most of my nights and weekends where I would be racing. So it's not really a big change for me. So this is going to be my fun project right now until I start racing again. Like I said, it's something I want to do for a while. If I don't do it now, I'm probably not going to do it. It's been sitting there, and honestly, I build cars for people all the time. We build, you know, take them like this. Actually, there's a bunch of cars that come in that are actually worse than this, but we take these cars all the time. I build them, I get all excited about them, and then it goes to someone else, you know, for a finish, which is awesome. But, you know, I want something that me and my family, like I said earlier in the video, that we can build, and I could just sit there and, you know, when I come out in the garage, I just look at it, and it just always here, and just know the hard work that goes into it. So that's what this car is going to be. Most of it's going to be completely replaced. I'm okay with that. I know when it's done, hopefully, it'll be a really cool looking ride, and it'll be rust free and built properly. So stay tuned and follow along on this build. Comment, give me some ideas on what you think, opinions, what parts to use. I'm open to it since I get to make the decision. So stay tuned for the rest of this car. Thanks for checking out this video. Thanks for checking out the project. Thanks for subscribing to my channel, liking my videos. And until the next time on this video, or like I said, we got plenty of other videos we're gonna fill in on other vehicles, so it's not gonna be just this car. So stay tuned. I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars.